Most people live as if tomorrow will look like yesterday, but that's rarely how history works. America is standing at a crossroad and has no idea what's coming. And the truth is, very few people see what's about to unfold. The changes ahead aren't whispers on the horizon, they're here, accelerating faster than most realize. The question is not if these shifts are coming, but how prepared we are when they fully arrive. So let us look at the bigger picture, not from a political standpoint, but from reality. Because I've been thinking about something a lot lately. There's something fascinating about how we humans process change. We tend to assume that the world we grew up in, the rules, the power structures, the way things work, will continue indefinitely. It's natural, it's comfortable, but history has a funny way of surprising us. Think about your own lives for a moment. Those of you who lived through the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds saw America at what many consider its peak. We'd just won World War II. Europe was rebuilding with our help. The Soviet Union was our only real competitor, and even then, we had advantages they couldn't match. American factories were humming. American innovation was leading the world. American culture was spreading everywhere. It felt permanent, didn't it? Like this was just how the world worked. America led, others followed. But here's the thing about history, it doesn't stand still. And the world that emerged after World War II, where America could essentially set the rules for everyone else, was actually the exception, not the norm. For most of human history, power has been distributed among multiple centers, multiple empires, kingdoms, trading powers. What we experienced for roughly 70 years was unusual. One country with such overwhelming advantages that it could influence decisions in nearly every corner of the globe. That era, let's call it the era of uncontested dominance, gave birth to something psychologists might call primacy thinking. It's the idea that because we've been number one for so long, we'll always be number one. It shaped policies, it shaped expectations, it shaped how American leaders spoke to the world. But if yesterday was defined by American primacy, today is defined by something else entirely, the rise of peers. Now, I want to be clear about something. This isn't about America becoming weak or irrelevant. That's not what's happening here. What's happening is that other parts of the world are catching up in ways that are measurable, visible, and accelerating, and pretending otherwise doesn't make us stronger, it makes us less prepared. Let me tell you what I mean with something concrete. If you were to visit China today, and I realize not many of you probably have, but if you were to walk through cities like Shenzhen or Shanghai, you'd see something remarkable. These aren't the Chinese cities you might remember from decades ago. They look like something out of a science fiction movie. Gleaming towers, infrastructure that puts many American cities to shame, technology integrated into daily life in ways that would surprise you. But it's not just about shiny buildings. It's about industrial capacity. When we talk about who actually makes things in the world today, not financial services or software, but physical products, China has built manufacturing capabilities that dwarf what America currently has. We're talking about producing somewhere between 70 and 80% of the world's solar panels, dominating electric vehicle production, controlling the supply chains for the batteries that will power the next generation of transportation. These aren't projections or guesses. These are realities you can measure. You can count the factories, you can look at the shipping manifests, you can see which ports are handling the most cargo. And here's what's particularly interesting. This isn't happening because of some grand conspiracy or unfair advantage. It's happening because of sustained investment, strategic planning, and focus on technologies that will matter for the next few decades. Remember when American companies used to think long-term? When we built the interstate highway system, not because it would pay off next quarter, but because we knew it would transform the country over decades? Well, that kind of thinking is alive and well, it's just happening elsewhere now. Take electric vehicles. For years, American automakers insisted that consumers didn't really want them. Too expensive, they said. Not practical. The infrastructure isn't there. Meanwhile, Chinese companies were investing billions in battery technology, manufacturing capacity, and supply chains. Today, they're not just competing with American electric vehicles, they're leading the global market. Or consider solar energy. Remember when America was a pioneer in solar technology? We invented much of the fundamental science. But while we were debating whether renewable energy was worth investing in, China was building the world's largest solar manufacturing infrastructure. Now, if America wants to rapidly scale up solar power, which we'll need to do for both energy independence and climate reasons, we're largely dependent on supply chains controlled by others. It's the same story in shipping. The massive cargo ships that carry goods around the world, most of them are being built in Chinese shipyards. The green shipping technologies that will be required as environmental regulations tighten, again, the leadership is coming from elsewhere. This isn't about pointing fingers or laying blame. It's about recognizing that while America was focused on other priorities, the world didn't wait for us. And the technologies that are becoming essential, renewable energy, electric transportation, advanced manufacturing, these aren't nice to have anymore. They're the foundation of economic power in the 21st century. But this isn't just about numbers, it's about the systems that power the future. Here's something that might surprise you. The gap between America and its competitors isn't just about who makes more stuff. It's about who's positioning themselves to lead in the technologies that will define the next 30 years. Think about artificial intelligence. Yes, America has some advantages here. Companies like Google and OpenAI are pushing boundaries. But the applications of AI, the integration into manufacturing, into city management, into transportation systems that's happening at massive scale in China, they're not just developing the technology, they're implementing it. Or think about the electrical grid. America's electrical infrastructure is largely from the mid-20th century. We're trying to retrofit old systems to handle new demands. Meanwhile, other countries are building smart grids from scratch, systems designed from the ground up to handle renewable energy, electric vehicle charging, and modern demands. The pattern is consistent. While America has been maintaining and incrementally improving systems built for an earlier era, competitors have been building new systems designed for the world that's actually emerging. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, America has always been innovative. We'll figure it out. We always do. And there's truth to that. American ingenuity is real. American universities still attract top talent from around the world. American companies are still capable of breakthrough innovations. But here's the challenge. Innovation without implementation is just interesting research. And implementation requires manufacturing capacity, supply chains, skilled workers, and the political will to invest in long-term projects, even when they don't pay off immediately. It's a bit like having the best recipe for a cake, but not having a kitchen, ingredients, or the time to bake it. The recipe is valuable, but someone else with a fully equipped kitchen and all the ingredients is going to be eating cake while you're still talking about your great recipe. And that gap has consequences not just for economies, but for how nations interact. This brings us to something that I think many Americans, especially those in leadership positions, haven't fully grasped yet. The world is moving toward what experts call multipolarity, multiple centers of power, rather than one dominant superpower. This isn't necessarily bad for America, but it does require a fundamentally different approach to how we engage with the world. Think of it this way. For decades, America could often get what it wanted through a combination of economic incentives and implicit pressure. We were such a large market and such a powerful military force that other countries had strong reasons to accommodate our preferences, even when they disagreed. But what happens when other countries have their own large markets, their own advanced technologies, their own financial systems? What happens when they can choose to work with America or work with someone else, and either choice is viable for them? This is the world we're entering. And it requires a different kind of leadership, one based more on partnership and less on dominance. One that recognizes that other countries have their own interests and their own capabilities. Unfortunately, much of American foreign policy is still based on what I call empire thinking. The idea that our job is to maintain control and that other countries should accept American leadership because that's how it's always been. But there's another way to think about this, and it comes from someone you might not expect. Adam Smith, the 18th century economist who wrote The Wealth of Nations. Smith was actually quite critical of the British Empire. He argued that Britain would be better off trading with its colonies as independent partners rather than trying to control them through force and political dominance. His reasoning was simple. Trade based on mutual benefit creates more wealth for everyone than relationships based on dominance and control. When you're trying to control someone, you have to spend enormous resources on maintaining that control. When you're trading with them as equals, you can focus your resources on creating value. From empire thinking to trade thinking, that's one way to summarize the choice America faces. We can keep trying to maintain dominance through military presence, economic pressure, and political influence. Or we can focus on being the kind of partner that other countries want to work with because it benefits them. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. That sounds nice in theory, but the world is a dangerous place. Don't we need to maintain our strength to protect ourselves and our allies? Absolutely. Strength matters. But there's a difference between strength that protects and strength that tries to control. There's a difference between being prepared to defend your interests and trying to dictate terms to countries that have their own legitimate interests. The problem with empire thinking is that it often creates the very conflicts it claims to be preventing. When you treat other countries as potential threats rather than potential partners, you encourage them to see you as a threat in return. And yet, many leaders still seem stuck in an older mindset. You can see this in how European leaders talk about Russia, how American leaders talk about China, how Western politicians discuss the rest of the world. There's still this underlying assumption that the natural order of things is for the West to lead and everyone else to follow. But here's the reality. Much of the world has moved beyond that assumption. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America increasingly see themselves as equals on the world stage, not as junior partners waiting for Western guidance. India, for example, has made it clear that it will work with America on some issues, with Russia on others, and with China on still others. They're not asking permission. They're making decisions based on what they think serves India's interests. Brazil takes a similar approach. So does Indonesia. So do many other countries that represent billions of people and enormous economic potential. This isn't defiance or ingratitude. It's maturity. These countries have developed their own capabilities, their own perspectives, their own goals. They're willing to cooperate when cooperation serves their interests, but they're not willing to subordinate their interests to someone else's agenda simply because that's how things used to work. The danger comes when fear drives choices more than facts. Now, this is where things get particularly concerning, because when you're used to being in control, other countries acting independently can feel threatening even when it's perfectly normal behavior. Take the situation in Europe right now. There's enormous anxiety about Russian intentions, and some of that anxiety is certainly justified. But there's also a lot of fear that seems disconnected from actual capabilities and actual threats. Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's. Its military, while still formidable in some ways, has shown significant weaknesses. Its population is declining. Its technological base, while advanced in some areas, lags behind in others. The idea that Russia is poised to overrun Western Europe requires ignoring quite a lot of evidence about Russia's actual capabilities and limitations. Yet, European leaders speak as if Russian tanks might roll into Paris next week. This kind of fear-based thinking leads to policies that often make the situation worse rather than better. Fear is a powerful political tool, but when it's disconnected from reality, it becomes dangerous. We saw this during the Cold War, where genuine concerns about nuclear weapons sometimes escalated into paranoia that prevented reasonable dialogue and compromise. I'm not saying that Russia doesn't pose any challenges or that all concerns are unfounded, but there's a difference between realistic caution and paralyzing fear. And right now, much of Western policy seems driven more by the latter than the former. The same pattern shows up in how America thinks about China. Yes, China's rise creates competitive pressures. Yes, there are areas where American and Chinese interests conflict. But the idea that China is an existential threat to American survival, that every Chinese success represents an American failure, that's fear-talking, not strategic thinking. What would realistic policy look like instead? It would start by honestly assessing both capabilities and intentions. It would look for areas where cooperation serves mutual interests. It would prepare for competition where interests truly conflict, and it would avoid the kind of zero-sum thinking that turns manageable challenges into unnecessary conflicts. Real dialogue could replace assumptions, yet it's rarely attempted. And in America, this gap between fear and reality is just as wide. Here's something that might shock you. American leaders today often issue what amount to orders to other countries, as if those countries have no choice but to comply. You must stop this. You must do that. You must accept our conditions. This works when you're dealing with countries that depend on you and have no alternatives. But what happens when you try to give orders to countries that have their own options? India has been told to stop buying Russian oil. Their response has been essentially, thanks for the input, but we'll make our own energy decisions based on our own needs. Brazil has been pressured to take certain positions in international disputes. Their response has been to chart their own course based on what they think serves Brazilian interests. These aren't acts of hostility toward America, they're acts of sovereignty, countries making their own decisions about their own affairs. But many American leaders seem genuinely surprised when other countries don't automatically defer to American preferences. It's as if the idea that other countries have their own legitimate interests hasn't fully sunk in. The multipolar world is a reality. Ignoring it accelerates decline. Which brings us to the heart of the problem: leadership itself. What does leadership look like in a world where you can't simply tell everyone else what to do? What does it look like when you have to actually persuade people rather than pressure them? It looks like understanding. It looks like listening. It looks like finding solutions that work for multiple parties rather than just dictating terms. It looks like being the kind of country that others want to work with, not because they have to, but because they benefit from the partnership. This isn't weakness, it's actually much harder than the old approach, when you can just impose your will. You don't have to be particularly creative or thoughtful. When you have to create genuine partnerships, you need to understand other people's perspectives, find common ground, and develop solutions that work for everyone involved. True leadership in today's world requires humility, knowledge, and foresight. It requires recognizing that the world has changed, and that old approaches may no longer work. But here's the challenge. The American political system, the American foreign policy establishment, the American military-industrial complex, they're all still largely organized around the assumption that America should and can maintain global dominance. That assumption shapes budgets, policies, and expectations. It influences how American leaders think about everything from trade deals to military deployments to diplomatic negotiations. And the job of a real leader, the job of the president, should be to say no when that system pushes for approaches that no longer match reality. But that requires someone who understands the changes that are happening and has the courage to acknowledge that old strategies need to be updated. Leadership today means navigating complexity, not dictating ultimatums. So the question becomes, what happens next if America doesn't adapt? History gives us some pretty clear examples of what happens when powerful countries refuse to acknowledge that the world has changed around them. It's not usually a sudden collapse. It's more like a gradual slide into irrelevance, punctuated by increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control through force rather than influence. Think about the British Empire. Britain didn't lose its empire overnight. It happened gradually, as other countries developed their own capabilities and realized they no longer needed British protection or guidance. The smart British leaders recognized this and managed the transition. The stubborn ones kept trying to maintain control long after they had the resources to do so effectively, which just made the eventual transitions more painful and expensive. Or consider the Soviet Union. The Soviet system collapsed partly because its leaders couldn't acknowledge that their approach to economics and technology was falling behind. They kept insisting that they were winning, even as their infrastructure crumbled and their people lost faith in the system. America isn't in either of those situations yet. American institutions are still strong. The American economy is still innovative. American universities and companies still attract talent from around the world. But the warning signs are there. Multipolarity is here to stay, economically, technologically, militarily. The question isn't whether this shift is happening, it's whether America adapts to it gracefully or fights it unsuccessfully. Let me paint a picture of what adaptation might look like, because I think this is where the conversation gets interesting rather than depressing. Imagine an America that focused its enormous resources on problems that actually need solving, rather than trying to maintain dominance over countries that no longer need to be dominated. What if, instead of spending hundreds of billions of dollars on military bases around the world, America invested that money in rebuilding its own infrastructure? What if, instead of trying to prevent other countries from developing their own technologies, America focused on developing better technologies of its own? What if American foreign policy was based on the simple principle of being the kind of partner that other countries actively want to work with? This isn't naive idealism, it's practical strategy. In a multipolar world, the countries that thrive are the ones that other countries choose to partner with, not the ones that try to compel cooperation through pressure. Think about Germany today. Germany doesn't have a massive military. It doesn't have military bases all over the world. It doesn't try to dictate terms to other countries. But German companies are successful globally because they make things people want to buy. German technology is respected because it solves real problems. German diplomacy is influential because other countries trust Germany to be an honest broker. Or consider South Korea. 50 years ago, South Korea was poorer than most African countries. Today, it's one of the world's most advanced economies. How did this happen? Not through military conquest or political dominance, but through education, innovation, and making products that people around the world value. These examples matter because they show that influence in the modern world comes from being useful, not from being powerful in the old-fashioned sense. But here's the challenge. Making this transition requires leaders who understand what's actually happening in the world. And right now, there's a troubling gap between the complexity of the challenges America faces and the depth of understanding among many American leaders. This isn't about intelligence or good intentions. It's about experience and knowledge. Leading in a multipolar world requires understanding how other countries think, what their interests are, how their systems work. It requires knowing enough history to recognize patterns. It requires enough humility to admit when old approaches aren't working. Unfortunately, much of American political leadership in both parties still operates as if it's 1990, and America can simply announce its preferences and expect the world to comply. You see this in trade negotiations where American representatives seem genuinely surprised that other countries have their own priorities. You see it in diplomatic initiatives that assume other countries should be grateful for American attention rather than skeptical of American motives. You see it in military planning that assumes American technological superiority in every domain, even as other countries develop their own advanced capabilities. This gap between assumptions and reality is dangerous, not just for America but for global stability. When leaders make decisions based on outdated understanding, those decisions often create new problems rather than solving existing ones. Let me give you a specific example of how this plays out. American leaders will often say something like, we need to prevent China from becoming the dominant power in Asia. But think about what that actually means from the perspective of Asian countries. China is the largest economy in the region. It's the biggest trading partner for most Asian countries. It's geographically part of Asia. Of course, China is going to have significant influence in Asia. That's not something America can prevent without creating enormous instability. The relevant question isn't how to prevent Chinese influence in Asia. The relevant question is how to ensure that Chinese influence is exercised responsibly and that other countries in the region have alternatives when they disagree with Chinese policies. But addressing that question requires working with Asian countries as partners, not trying to enlist them as supporters in an American campaign to contain China. This kind of strategic thinking requires leaders who can see beyond the next election cycle or the next news cycle. It requires understanding that successful foreign policy is often about patience, persistence, and building trust over time. It requires the wisdom to know when to compete, when to cooperate, and when to simply focus on your own problems and let other countries focus on theirs. And here's the most important part. It requires the courage to say no to powerful interests that benefit from the old approaches, even when those approaches no longer serve the broader national interest. Because, let's be honest about something, there are groups in America that do very well from the current system. Defense contractors benefit from military spending. Foreign policy establishments benefit from America playing a global role. Some companies benefit from economic arrangements that give America special advantages. These aren't necessarily bad people, and their interests aren't necessarily illegitimate, but their interests aren't the same as the broader national interest. And a real leader has to be able to distinguish between what serves specific constituencies and what serves the country as a whole. This is where we get to what might be the most challenging part of the whole equation. I feel like our political system rewards short-term thinking, partisan positioning, and appealing to narrow constituencies. It punishes nuanced thinking, long-term planning,